You know, we're all biased in some way. And those of us who value objectivity generally try to fight it off. And I'm going to give you an example of it because, mm, you know, um, I I think it's important. I recently watched this little video of an English teacher complaining about the AI stuff and what he was facing with AI. Anyway, um, when I was teaching English, and I did it for 30 years at the college level, uh, and my job as a teaching, particularly freshmen, was to teach them a certain number of rhetorical styles and how to construct those rhetorical styles, persuasion, for example. And every semester, I would get a paper from a student, particularly from a religious school, but not always, who, and of course, the purpose of a position paper is to state your position and why, right? That's the simplest definition of a position paper. And a student who's basically using and quoting the Bible to support their arguments or their reasons for believing what they believe or thinking the way they think, in that context is not unreasonable. And so when I would get one of those papers, then I would say to that student before I graded the paper, because of course, what am I looking for? I'm looking for the structure. I'm looking for how convincing it is. I'm looking for the argument development. I'm looking for the thesis. These are the things that I look for, and I can look for them because being in the ministry for 30 years, I know exactly what. But the thing is that 18-year-olds are very egocentric, and generally they think the world is just like them or they're not like anybody. It's one way or the other. And so I would ask them, I would say, please, before I grade this paper, define your audience. What do you mean, Professor? Well, tell me who you expect to get their hands on this paper. Who do you hope to convince, or who do you hope to make understand your point? Who are you looking? Who is the audience? Well, everybody. And then the paper, I would just say, well, look, then you've got to use a different source. And they would get mad. It's my religion, professor. Yes, of course it is. And if your audience is your religion, the grade is different. Quite frankly, I've never heard of another teacher doing that, but I did it. And if they said, "Oh, it's the people in my church," or "It's the people who it's only for Christians," like there's a whole genre of Christian literature that's out there for Christians. If they said Christians, all right, Christians, let's see how effective is this argument. And of course, being a pastor, I kind of knew the Bible too, you know what I mean? And so I would in my comments, I would say, what about this and what about that? What about this verse? Are you aware that? And of course, then uh, you know, maybe they first confront some of the contradictions in the Christian Bible. But the point is that you're seeing one thing, and maybe you're not going to convince people because they're thinking this. And so I would do that, and I would grade the paper on that merit. But almost always, and I say almost because who knows, it's a long time ago. But almost always, I would look at them. And of course, by the way, I mean, international students had the same issue. Like they would see a kid from Germany, for example, would see an argument in a certain way and think he was being persuasive when he wasn't. I once had a girl actually write her paper in French. in an English class. She had been recruited to play some sport for the university. And, you know, I'm not fluent, but I could read her French. And I made a few comments. I made them in English, you know, but I tried to help her see the logic that we were looking for, but also that this was an English class and she had to write it in English. I'll never forget. But anyway, so I've never heard of other professors doing that. But what I would do after that paper is I would begin then asking students as a preliminary writing exercise to write a definition of their audience, number one. Maybe on another assignment, I would assign the audience, like generally college freshmen or students at this university or or and that goes all that would cover, and I would be able to say things like, well, there are graduate students here, but maybe a little more academic, or so. But why do we jump to conclusions because we have in our mind some sort of standard? Yesterday I was in this talk, and this guy asked me if I would consider a friendship with a very conservative person. And yeah, it was a little political, this discussion was, and people, I actually left the conversation. I blocked it because it was so vitriolic. People on both sides not listening to each other, not caring, just sort of shouting words at each other, trying to win, like you're going to win. And I said, sure. As long as we don't devolve into bickering, basically the way this post responses were, the way it was going. And, it's silly. It's just silly. Let me, in our society, let me understand you for who you are. And you have to understand how people perceive you. Let me take another minute of your time. I had a guy come into my office. He's upset. He's lonely. He had this girlfriend for a while, and he was upset that she left him. Be she left me because she says I'm a racist. Okay, are you a racist? No. Okay. Well, what made her think you're a racist? I don't know. Okay. And then uh, uh, I don't know if he's a racist or not. I don't know how he feels. But then he started spouting off on replacement theory. Like somehow everybody who isn't white is conspiring to take over the white world, fill it up with black and brown people, and take over, so that it becomes brown privilege and not white privilege. I'm sorry to laugh, but that's really. But I'm listening to this, and he's spouting this theory off to me, and I said, I stopped him. This was a consultation. I knew the minute I opened my mouth to respond to this, I figured we wouldn't be working together. And I said, when you talk and you try to communicate, you have to think about who's listening and how they are going to respond. Whether you actually believe this theory or not isn't the point. The point is the way you talk about it to someone who doesn't believe that sounds racist. It sounds like you don't like black or brown people. Now, was he racist? Never came back. But I said, if you want, this is where we have to work. And do you see my point? So if you look at me and say you're biased, of course I'm biased. Of course I am. We all have biases. You can't not. But if we consciously try to acknowledge our own bias, if we consciously try to hear what someone else is saying, and number one, imagine, and this is for all my hypno buddies, you know what I'm talking about. Imagine what series of events and perceptions of those events has led this person, like my client, to believe, or that guy who was going to be my client, to believe what they believe and to act on that belief, to hold those beliefs. And presumably they stretch down into their values. So when I meet somebody, excuse me, who wants, for excuse me, for example, Donald Trump to make the world a better place, is going to make us great again. I don't know what they mean by great. Do they mean white? Do they mean filled with, gold lame and phony wealth? Does that mean make it great for rich people and not poor people? I'm still waiting for it to trickle down. It ain't trickling down. But, what is it that you mean by great? Why don't we ask that question? What would make America great again, really? Instead of depending on someone who's never been to a grocery store on his own. And I'm not being political in the statement. I don't think he understands. For him, life is a ballroom. Glitzy, fancy dinners, powerful people. That's been his life. All right. I've said my piece. I let's just try to get along, please. And let's talk about what we really want to see. Not just those button issues, but what kind of America do we want to live in?